One is not born, but rather becomes a woman. No biological, psychological, or economic fate determines the figure that the human female represents in society. It is civilization as a whole that produces this creature, intermediate between male and eunuch, which is described as feminine.
Il y a même quelquefois une manière de faire de la vérité, une espèce d'arme agressive. Et finalement, c'est souvent les hommes qui font ça. Non seulement ils trompent leurs femmes, mais ils se plaisent à leur dire. Et c'est beaucoup plus pour se complaire à eux que pour vraiment avoir un rapport de transparence avec l'autre.
Vous pensez pas que c'est
Donc
une
ça
valeur
non
en
plus
soi?
n'en fait pas une valeur en soi, non.
C'est ça, oui.
C'est une chance si ça arrive, qu'on puisse tous dire. Mais c'est pas une valeur en soi.
Now, what peculiarly signalizes the situation of woman is that she, a free and autonomous being like all human creatures, nevertheless finds herself living in a world where men compel her to assume the status of the other.
When I read The Second Sex, I was at Oxford, and I read it, I think, shortly after it came out. It was a very disturbing book. In fact, it almost, early editions often had nude ladies on it and stuff. It almost had a sort of, you know, mischievous cachet. Apparently it was so subversive that it got mixed up with being a little sexy, too. But you were a real firebrand if you read that book, and if you paid any attention to it, you were a maladjusted, you know, all the awful things you tried so hard not to be, you know, castrating bitch, or, you know, like, not satisfied with your fate, or in need of a therapist or something. People fought about that book all the time.
She's been a very important role model, as she has been for lots of women. And in that sense, she's been a mother. The mother, in some ways, that I think some of us wished we had ourselves. And like one's own mother, I think we thought of her as being immortal, so that the news of her death was actually very shocking. It simply hadn't occurred to us that there would be a world that didn't contain her.
She said the sort of things that I wanted my mother to say. For instance, when I said to my mother, I'm going to university, the first thing she said to me was, what about your husband and children? What she was saying was they come first, you know. And I was very angry and very dismayed at that, whereas I had this fantasy of ringing Simone de Beauvoir, and she was saying, great, you know, go for it, what are you going to study, you know, just give me a ring if you need any help. I mean, she was really there.
40 years after the first publication of The Second Sex, Simone de Beauvoir's famous critique of the situation of women, we look at the influence she has had on women worldwide through her life and her work, which included autobiography, fiction and philosophy. Simone de Beauvoir was born in 1908 to a wealthy bourgeois family above a café in the heart of Paris.
My situation in the family resembled that of my father in his childhood and youth. He had found himself suspended between the airy scepticism of my grandfather and the bourgeois earnestness of my grandmother. In my own case, too, my father's individualism and pagan ethical standards were in complete contrast to the rigidly moral conventionalism of my mother's teaching. This imbalance, which made my life a kind of endless disputation, is the main reason why I became an intellectual.
Due to the sudden bankruptcy of her father's family, the de Beauvoirs were forced to move to a more modest flat. Money was short, and it became obvious that Simone and her sister Helene would eventually have to earn their own living. Simone was bright, and at school it was clear she had the potential to follow a professional career, although this is not what her father would have chosen for her.
In those days, people of my parents' class thought it unseemly for a young lady to go in for higher education. To train for a profession was a sign of defeat. It goes without saying that my father was a vigorous anti-feminist.
Where did you get your first copy of The Second Sex?
It was given to me by my first boyfriend in 1960, who wrote in it something like, "To Anne from Christopher with love." I didn't quite understand at the time why he'd given it to me, and I didn't read it then. I had trouble remembering when I started to read it, but it must have been in the late 60s. I had 2 small children and was trying to adjust myself well to the role of full-time mother and not succeeding. I decided to register for a PhD and to study the attitudes of women to housework, to look at the housework side of motherhood as a job. It was regarded as a huge joke by the male academic establishment, who thought that I must be talking about something quite different, and there were various attempts to make me study the sexual satisfaction of women in marriage, that being the nearest they could get at the time to seeing that there was something actually serious to be studied and in the role of women in the home. So it was with great difficulty that I found a supervisor and struggled through the process of doing a PhD. And in order to do that, I found myself reading an enormous amount of literature, because that sort of question leads you to ask really quite basic questions about why the roles of men and women are different. And in the course of pursuing those sorts of questions, I read The Second Sex. I found it very inspiring, which is, I think, what many other women have found, because, I suppose, of the very strong statement that it contained, that these things were nothing to do with biology. They were not determined for you, except by social forces, and therefore, there was room for change, and that was an inspiring message. Also, I mean, the areas in which de Beauvoir covers in that book, I mean, she covers, you know, anthropology, economics, psychology, psychoanalysis, a whole range of disciplines. That was also inspiring. Well, she said once that she had not ever regretted not having children because mother-daughter relationships were so awful. She assumed, I suppose, that if she was going to have children, she would have had female children, which might not have been the case. However, I think that she felt very ambivalent about her own mother, and that comes out in a lot of what she wrote. Because, almost, she didn't have children herself, I think she didn't come to see the positive side, to experience the positive side in the next generation. Why did my mother's death shake me so deeply? Since the time I left home, I had felt little in the way of emotional impulse towards her. Generally speaking, I thought of her with no particular feeling. Yet in my sleep, she often played a most important part. She blended with Sartre, and we were happy together. And then the dream would turn into a nightmare. Why was I living with her once more? How had I come to be in her power again? So our former relationship lived on in me in its double aspect, a subjection that I loved and hated. There are photographs of both of us, taken at about the same time. I am 18, she is nearly 40. Today I could almost be her mother and the grandmother of that sad-eyed girl. I am so sorry for them. For me, because I am so young, and I understand nothing. For her, because her future is closed, and she has never understood anything.
A star pupil, Simone won a place at the elite college, the École Normale Supérieure, where she was to study philosophy in preparation for a teaching career. It was here that she met Jean-Paul Sartre, who was to become her lover and lifelong companion. On principle, they decided to remain as free and independent individuals. They would never marry and wouldn't live together, although they would share every aspect of their lives.
Whenever other people made attempts to analyse me, they did so from the standpoint of their own little worlds, and this used to exasperate me. But Sartre always tried to see me as part of my own scheme of things, to understand me in the light of my own set of values and attitudes. It was the first time in my life that I had felt intellectually inferior to anyone else. What we have, he said, is an essential love. But it is a good idea for us also to experience contingent love affairs. We were two of a kind, and our relationship would endure as long as we did.
Do you think anyone that had a relationship with Sartre ever really threatened Simone's relationship with him?
One day I asked Simone, do you recite a little Sartre adventure? She told me, well, it depends of the woman. When they are nice women, I don't resent it at all. But when some women were wicked with her and tried to put it out, well, it was natural that she resented it. It was not jealousy, it was, she was afraid. freedom is the most beautiful thing, but it is also the most difficult thing.
My sister no longer lives in Paris. At present, her husband is in the Council of Europe, which has its headquarters in Strasbourg. They bought an old Alsatian farmhouse in a village, and they have turned it into a charming, comfortable home. From morning until night, even in their very cold winters, she shuts herself up in her studio and she paints. She has always refused both the shackles of representation and the barrenness of abstraction. She has discovered an increasingly delicate balance between formal invention and allusion to reality.
Do you think she dominated you in a way?
Yes, but she never oppressed me. That is different. She dominated me because she was the eldest. And she was strong, she had everything to dominate me. And as she was very good with me, very nice, it was easy to be dominated.
Do you think you were closer to your mother than Simone?
Oh yes, because she was a little afraid of Simone, and she was not afraid of me. My father was le vrai boulevardier. It was some type of Parisian man before the Great War, and he wanted to marry a virtuous woman to be sure that his wife would not ever have a lover, and my mother never had. And he liked easy life. And she was a woman of strong duty. She thought much about duty, you know.
Both you and Simone decided not to have children. Could you tell me why?
Oh, there are several reasons. First thing, we had no very good rapport with our parents. And we did not wish to have daughters who would talk about us as we sometimes talked about our mother. And the other reason is that she wanted to make a work, and wanted to paint, and it is very, very difficult to really write important books or to paint important pictures with children. Why I became feminist? Because I could never think that men are better than women. Because for me, Simone was the most extraordinary person in the world. And I always thought that. I still think that. Our father, without willing it, he showed us a window, the opening of a window, and I think we went to the rose window.
The time came when I had to go after a job. I was assigned one in Marseille and felt scared stiff. I had envisaged worse exiles than this, but I had never really believed in them. Now suddenly it was all true. Faced with my state of panic, Sartre proposed to revise our plans. If we got married, he said, we would have the advantages of a double post, and in the long run, such a formality would not seriously affect our way of life. I may say that not for one moment was I tempted to fall in with his suggestion.
I had a strange sort of purple hat, which was the nearest thing I could do to a turban. I decided I wanted to study philosophy, for no other reason than that I'd heard that de Beauvoir studied philosophy, and I thought it sounded interesting. I really didn't know anything about it at all. One of the things that people always find depressing about Britain, one of the things that makes it actually very hard in this country to not make a living, I mean not make money, but actually just make a life, writing or thinking or reading, is, you know, the absence of sort of public life, of cafes and restaurants. I actually think that's very important. It's not just a thing you get into because you're an adolescent. I mean, actually that dimension is really important. There was a bit in Force of Circumstance, I think, where she talks about her and Sartre going to Edinburgh, which is where I come from, and they only stay there for about 2 days because they simply cannot bear it. They ask for a cup of tea, and the landlady says, no, you can't have a cup of tea, it's after breakfast time. It's only recently I started finding Force of Circumstance the one most interesting. It used to be the prime of life, very much. I was just completely grabbed by the sense of history being lived through. I think, I mean, I'd be very surprised if there's a finer account of the Algerian War as it was actually happening anywhere, you know. Just a whole world falling apart that comes with the war, you know. I mean, I've never sensed that in my life. I don't think, well, people born after the Second World War in Western Europe haven't. I think it's part of everyday life in Eastern Europe and in most of the rest of the world. And I think it's tremendously important to realise, you know, that the world is contingent in that sense. It could fall apart. When I reread this quite recently, it just became really clear to me that Simone de Beauvoir never really wanted to write about the world. All she wanted to do was eat it. And her whole philosophy seems to come from this moment. So here goes. The world became more intimately part of me when it entered through my mouth than through my eyes and my sense of touch. I would not accept it entirely. The insipidity of milk puddings, porridge and mashes of bread and butter made me burst into tears. The oiliness of fat meat and the clammy mysteries of shellfish revolted me. Tears, screams, vomitings. My repugnance was so deeply rooted that in the end they gave up trying to force me to eat those disgusting things. On the other hand, I eagerly took advantage of that privilege of childhood which allows beauty, luxury and happiness to be things that can be eaten. I mean, it's all there, you know. There's that sort of linking of ideas with feeling, with eating, with that tremendous zest and enthusiasm for life. You know, it's more than just thought, it's physical.
After teaching in Marseille and Rouen, de Beauvoir returned to Paris.
My eyes were not opened immediately after the Munich crisis, far from it. The threat of war had receded, and I recovered confidence in the future. Left-wing opinions were divided on the value of the peace concessions we had gained. A large number of intellectuals went about repeating their assertion that the democracies have just declared peace in the world. Then suddenly, history burst over me, and I dissolved into fragments. I woke to find myself scattered over the four quarters of the globe, linked by every nerve in me to each and every other individual. I became used to the grey and green uniforms and the swastika flag flying over the Senate.
I first listening through my mother because she saw in a newspaper a review of one of the books. And she told me, sounds to me this woman is going to understand you better than I do. So I am going to give you as a present the book. It was called Memoirs of a Beautiful Daughter. That's how I came across the first book of Simone de Beauvoir. As was given by her, I said, well, really, she doesn't understand things about adolescent people, so I keep the book. We went on holidays and we came back from holidays. My mother suddenly died very soon after. So I said, well, perhaps I am going to find some consolation reading the book that she gave to me. And I started to read the book under that condition. I wrote to her when I read the second book, it sounds to me, because I disagree with something what she said. Nevertheless, I saw that it was better to discuss with her personally what she thought, because I didn't know other women who thought like that, you see. Several months after, I received a letter from Simone telling me that she was quite touched by my letter, that she has given a lot of thought to what I said, and these sort of things encouraged her to keep writing her memories. In my mind, my life looked a little bit as hers. So I started to take every single piece of advice from there. The best students of my generation were chosen by the university for studying abroad. I was living in the south of Chile in a very conservative society. So I was living with one of the students, and as a companions, we decided to marry because I thought that I was going to expel from Chile. After the coup, they were asking for the foreigners who were lecturing at the university, and they ought to go to the police station. So instead of doing that, I went into hiding with my little girl. My husband hiding in another part of the country. And I was extremely afraid because my house has been ransacked and everything was destroyed. And the night of the coup, I would like to have the book of Simone as far away as possible because they were subversive from the point of view of the police. So I would like to be as far away, don't be recognized as the owner of this book, but I thought a lot about what she said about the resistance, how she has been going through the period of the war, and gave me a lot of consolation, but I was unable to read the book really because I left the house altogether and I was into hiding. I decided that perhaps was going to be the last time that I stayed with Janina, or the last time that Janina is going to be alive. So I decided to take a picture in which no one could see me, but could see Janina. In order she could be found if something happened to me or to her, because at that very moment all the children were disappearing as well as the adults. During those days of repression, when I saw people torture and things like that, gave me a lot of consolation and comfort to remember that Simone has been involved in helping women in my situation. Simone has always been for me someone who cares about other people strongly, and people like her is very, very important for the survival of other individuals. So for me it was sort of, I'm sure if she will know of me, she will do something for me, for instance. And this is very, very important in that situation of survival. To know that someone, even if you die, will know why you died, you see? It's very important.
All that day, Sartre and I walked the flag-draped streets of Paris. I saw women in their best clothes clinging round soldiers' necks. The tricolour shone resplendent from the summit of the Eiffel Tower. What a tumult of emotions surged through my heart. Seldom does one achieve a long-awaited pleasure and find it all one could have hoped for, but such was my good fortune on this occasion.
By the end of the war, de Beauvoir and Sartre had become leaders of a political and philosophical group known as existentialists, and came to symbolise for a whole generation the avant-garde way of life. Their followers were writers and artists, including the charismatic singer Juliette Gréco. De Beauvoir's first book, a novel based on a triangular liaison she and Sartre formed with a young woman, examined the problem of jealousy in a free relationship. It was a big success, and this enabled her to give up teaching and establish herself as a full-time writer.
I considered myself obviously an existentialist, and I had seen photographs of Juliette Gréco, and that get-up was perfect for me because I was very poor. I was the first person from my family to go to college. Now, the way college girls dressed then was sort of little cashmere sweater sets and pearls and or very dressy little suits. Well, I had none of that gear. However, I could perfectly well dress as an existentialist on nothing at all, in black jeans, a black turtleneck, my hair down, and a lot of red lipstick and eye makeup. So it was perfect for me. Not only was it aesthetically satisfying, but it was dirt cheap, and didn't show dirt either, for that matter. So it was just perfect. I married France, really. I married the left. I married, the Jews who had survived the war. I married many things. I also married a particular, French physicist, and that was the problem. And what turned out to be a very conventional bourgeois marriage. By the second year of the marriage, it was very clear that there was no space. There was no space for me. Whatever I wanted to do, you didn't do it like that. Whatever I wanted to be, you couldn't be like that. Around the summer, I was coming to the conclusion that this was not a road I was prepared to go down any further. I read The Second Sex, and there in the flyleaf it says Chicago, 1959. She provided in The Second Sex an analysis for experiences that were familiar to me, but because you cannot, if you do not have a vocabulary, you cannot handle your own experience. One of the things that feminism does for women is name things. So that once you name something, it exists for you, you can handle it in your mind, you can turn it around, you can decide what to do about it. But if things have no names, all you can do is feel this sense of uneasiness. It's a personal thing then. Instead of being an issue, it's your own problem. Why do I feel weird? Why do I feel strange? What did I do? Her life, too, as the memoirs began to come out, represented a way of life in which a woman had chosen to be in relationships, multiple relationships, to remain committed to her own work, committed to her own politics, to retain her sense of integrity without giving up life as a woman, and to remain open through her life to new experiences, to new people, to constant growth, to the political change. And all of that was tremendously exciting and moving to me. It was a great example. She had a central relationship, which was, after a short time, not a sexual relationship, but which defined her life. Her thoughts, her projects were all shared with Sartre. I never wanted anybody at the center of my life like that. I never wanted to share my work. My work is at the center of my life. The intellectual space around that is very jealously guarded.
Because you are married to a writer now,
yes.
aren't you?
Oh, yes, and I have a probably more intense relationship with him than I've ever had with a man, and more communicative. But still, the basic political decisions, basic creative decisions are autonomous. Just as Sartreans will always assume that she just, did a little piece of it or something. I've always thought that her intelligence was in his service more than I would have liked it to have been. Though, as I say, I have tremendous respect for Sartre also. Because I came to him first, I retain a respect for him, and I always was interested in his mind and his interests also. But I'm not sure it was the best thing that ever happened to her. But she was convinced of it, and after all, she has to be the expert in her own life.
The Mandarins won the Prix Goncourt in 1954. The novel was about a relationship she had with an American writer and set among the left-wing intellectuals of Paris.
America became still closer to me when I became attached to Nelson Algren towards the end of my stay. Although I related this affair very approximately in The Mandarins, I return to it now, not out of any taste for gossip, but in order to examine more closely a problem that in the prime of life I took to be too easily resolved. Is there any possible reconciliation between fidelity and freedom? And if so, at what price?
I think it was not an equal relationship. I think she was always at his beck and call, that if she had other relationships in her life, however passionate they may have been, they were while she was allowed out, so to speak, and if he said, come back home, she came back home. And we know that, did in fact happen, with the Nelson Algren relationship, for instance. And I don't call that a free and equal relationship. Whether a free and equal relationship is ever possible, of course, is another question. But she projects the idea that it is possible, and clearly, in her case, that was not so. When my marriage broke up, when I was 30, with 2 small children, I obviously had to go back to work in a full-time sense. I felt very strongly when I began to publish books that I did not only want to write novels. I felt that a writer who was, to me, a real writer, I now think that is not the only alternative, but that for me, I felt I wanted to be politically involved. I wanted to write political stuff, literary criticism. I wanted to be engaged in the real kind of French sense. I really was thinking of de Beauvoir. I thought, that's the kind of whole person that I want to be. My first task was really to reread The Second Sex, and I found that for what I wanted to say and the way I wanted to say it was of no use to me whatsoever. It seemed to belong to another age for a start. Her attitude to female sexuality is extremely ambivalent, and I realized with hindsight that as a young woman I had been baffled and bewildered by what she had to say at a time when my own knowledge of my own body was, say, limited, to say the least. You see, in the early 50s, one of the great questions was, are women frigid, and if so, why? It really was a huge debating point, and there are a lot of books written about it. De Beauvoir does not help to answer that question at all. She's very ambivalent. She tends to say things like, well, a lot of women are quite happy if they just feel nice all over, this kind of thing. There's absolutely nothing definite about women's orgasms, which of course was one of the big debating points in another sense in the 70s when people like me were writing on the subject of women. I feel that she actually not only worships Sartre, but she worships the kind of attitudes and behaviour and standards, cultural standards, let's say, that men like him project. And that what she really feels is that women may be at a disadvantage because of their biology, but biology can be overcome up to a point. And we are obviously subject to social conditioning as well. She doesn't turn the whole thing on its head and say, well, you know, what's so good about being a woman?
Wanting to talk about myself, I became aware that to do so, I should first have to describe the condition of women in general. I hadn't expected to become involved in writing such a vast work. But it was true that my study of the myths would be left hanging in mid-air if people didn't know the reality those myths were intended to mask. I undertook to recount systematically, from childhood to old age, how they were created. I examined the possibilities this world offers women, those it denies them, their limits, their good and bad luck, their evasions and their achievements. I spent only 2 years on this work. I already knew some sociology and psychology, and thanks to my university training, I had the habit of efficient working methods. "22,000 copies were sold in the first week. But it shocked people. I was accused of so many things, everything. I received, some signed and some anonymous, epigrams, epistles, satires, admonitions and exhortations addressed to me by, for example, some very active members of the first sex. Unsatisfied, frigid, priapic, nymphomaniac, lesbian, 100 times aborted, I was everything.
I was almost 23. We got married in November 1973 and I had a child 11 months later. I felt very empathetic with him in lots of ways, but as soon as I had this boy and this son, I remember walking in from the ambulance, you know, coming home with my child, and my mother was there, and he rushed out the door and said, I've got to go to work. And it was very significant because he then felt that because he had a son, particularly a son, I think, he had to go out there and work, and he sort of didn't really come back in a way. I got very depressed after the second one. We lived in a small town in Essex. One day I was feeling very strange, and I'd had experiences of sort of being quite detached from my body and, you know, things like that, anxiety. My heart would flutter quite a lot. But I went into a fruit shop and I had my oldest child with me, who was about 4, and the young child in the pushchair. And I looked at the fruit and I didn't know what it was. And I had a moment of real panic, and then I had this money in my hand and I didn't know what the money was. And I felt very strange and very weird. And I looked at Dan's head in the pushchair, and that was the only thing that connected me to anything. I felt really quite out of my head, I suppose. I was looking for answers to what was wrong with me, because although I thought I was mad, probably, I thought I had a private, individual problem. But I used to read the problem pages avidly, and people would always say things like, you know, I don't fancy making love to my husband anymore, what's wrong with me? And the answer would always be, oh, come on, dear, you know, get a nice, sexy nightie and everything will be all right. So I never found any compensation in that. So I saw her book one day in a bookshop, and I just bought it, really, because it said the second sex and it was intriguing. And I read the bit about housework, and I remember I bought it in 1979, and I started reading it at about 8 o'clock, and I don't think I went to bed till about 4, and I don't know, it just completely turned me inside out. It was amazing. It was as if somebody had come into the room and talked to me for the first time and said, it's all right to feel what you feel. It's all right. And that what was so amazing was that other women felt it as well, millions and thousands of them. And also reading de Beauvoir made me realise that how real it is that men exist in the outside public domain, they're citizens and everything else, and that we live our lives through them. I mean, my husband used to come home and I almost used to say to him really hungrily, you know, what's it like out there? What's going on out there? And when I became very distraught, like in the shop, and it happened more than once, it was because it was out there. And my whole reality became only when I was at home. So my connections with the outside world became through him. I mean, she said all that, you see. It was amazing. And it was as if, it wasn't as if she had invented it. It was as if it had always been like that, but I hadn't put all the pieces together. Well, a few months after reading de Beauvoir, I realised I had to do something for myself. I'd been on antidepressants. So I applied to university with quite a lot of resistance on the part of my husband, because he felt very strongly that Dan, who was only 2 when I applied, should be looked after by me. And I think that made me feel very guilty. But I applied and got in because I walked into the interview and suddenly I was amazing, you know what I mean? I just told them that they should really have me there, you know. And that was the first time that I'd really been confident for a long time. I was very frightened and everything, but I was so determined to go. And then started feeling very guilty, but nevertheless still went. So Dan went to a nursery and Tom went to school. And then began the juggling act that all these women have of who picks who up, you know, and sitting in a philosophy lecture thinking about fish fingers and, you know, all those problems. The validity of the cook's work is to be found only in the mouths of those around her table. She needs their approbation, demands that they appreciate her dishes and call for second helpings. She's upset if they're not hungry, to the point that one wonders whether the fried potatoes are for her husband or her husband for the fried potatoes. This ambiguity is evident in the general attitude of the housekeeping wife. She takes care of the house for her husband, but she also wants him to spend all he earns for furnishings and an electric refrigerator. I think of her as Sartre's other, although I respect her tremendously, and I think she was probably much more wonderful. And in fact, historically, I think she will endure much more than him, because already, I mean, nobody reads Being in Nothingness anymore, and his books are all right, but they're a bit wacky. I think she'll endure more, but I think I'll always think of her as his other.
Certain aspects of love, well, after 40, one has to give them up. I loathed what I called harridans, and promised myself that when I reached that stage, I would dutifully retire to the shelf. All of which had not kept me from embarking on a love affair at 39. Now, at 44, I was relegated to the land of the shades. Yet, as I have said, although my body made no objection to this, my imagination was much less resigned. When the opportunity arose of coming back to life, I seized it gladly.
She did form a relationship with a much younger man, Claude Lantzmann, the only man she actually lived with. From the traumatic experience of watching her mother die, de Beauvoir wrote a moving account, A Very Easy Death.
For me, my mother had always been there, and I had never seriously thought that someday, that soon, I should see her go. Her death, like her birth, had its place in some legendary time. When I said to myself, she is of an age to die, the words were devoid of any meaning, as so many words are. For the first time, I saw her as a dead body under suspended sentence. I was wrong in 1962 when I thought nothing significant would happen to me anymore, apart from calamities. Now, once again, a great piece of good fortune was offered to me. A girl in a class preparing for the École Normale wrote to me saying that she would like to meet me. Her letter was short and direct, and it convinced me that she had a sincere liking for philosophy and for my books. I replied, telling her that I should get in touch with her at the end of the holidays. And so I did. The better I knew Sylvie, the more akin I felt to her. She too was an intellectual, and she too was passionately in love with life. And she was like me in many other ways. With 33 years of difference, I recognize my qualities and my faults in her. She is as thoroughly interwoven in my life as I am in hers. There is such an interchange between us that I lose the sense of my age. She draws me forwards into her future, and there are times when the present recovers a dimension that it had lost.
This is a desk where she wrote everything. Everything, no, but because she bought this studio in 1954 after the Prix Goncourt. And so she wrote here about this little desk. Some of them I took myself. Here, traveling with her in Spain. This one is funny because it's a Sartre birthday. It's in my home. We went in my home. She did not possess her own books, you know, because she gave everything to her friends, students. She was for me what Sartre was for her, you know. Equality, but admiration. But absolutely not motherhood and so on. She didn't want a daughter. No, no, not at all. And I didn't want a mother because of my personal experience with my mother. I did not want at all this kind of relation again, you know. So we were friends in spite of the difference of ages, but I never thought to her age, you know, never. She thought about it because she said, but I will die before you. She said the relation between human beings, we are not fixed. A man and a woman have to create it, and a man with another man, why not? And a woman with another woman, you know. And everything is possible. And I thought it was true. For me, she was first a writer, not first a feminist. And she was a little irritated because everybody saw her first like a feminist, you know. She was cheerful, she enjoyed very much life. She did everything herself. She answered almost all the letters she received from readers, you know. And I think she was very well organized, and she knew to say no. Sartre did not know to say no, so he was eaten by people, you know. She was quite with the feminists, but she did not agree with the feminists who wanted to separate men and women, you know, the radical, you know, feminists. With that, she always said, I don't agree. I understand why they are like that, but I don't agree. For me, women and men must not be enemies, you know. And I share all these ideas.
Was Sartre a feminist?
Yes, he said so, and he wanted to be a feminist, and he was. He had good will. But he recognized himself. He had big vices, machist vices, bad habits, you know, with women. And personally, he was with the women old-fashioned. Treating them like minors, you know, children. But he was guilty. He was, and when she wrote Second Sex, he was encouraging her always. He was feminist in his thought. But he was not feminist in his practical, like a lot of, not a lot, but like some men.
Pour ce qui est de la question du rapport de la femme et de l'homme, je suis absolument d'accord avec Simone de Beauvoir. Pour ce qui est de l'organisation sans les hommes, je me suis souvent demandé si c'était nécessaire ou non. Je ne peux pas répondre actuellement puisque je vois bien que pour les femmes c'est nécessaire actuellement, et je me demande si c'est la vraie forme de lutte. C'est-à-dire si des formes qui liraient des hommes qui pensent comme elle à elle ne pourraient pas avoir aussi une importance.
Mais les hommes ne pensent jamais tout à fait comme les femmes.
C'est ce que vous me répétez toujours.
Oui, c'est ça.
Vous voudriez dire que vous n'avez pas confiance en moi sur ce point.
Et même vous qui êtes théoriquement, idéologiquement tout à fait partisan de l'émancipation des femmes et tout ça, eh bien, vous ne partagez malgré tout pas ce qu'elles appellent, et que j'appellerai avec elles, le vécu des femmes. Il y a des choses que vous n'arrivez pas à comprendre. Et très souvent, par exemple, Sylvie, qui est très proche aussi du BFLM, et moi, nous vous attaquons là-dessus parce qu'il y a des choses que vous ne pouvez pas sentir.
Votre relation a réduit toutes les tierces personnes à un rôle secondaire.
Oui, c'est-à-dire que les tiers, tant dans la vie de Sartre que dans ma vie à moi, évidemment, dès le début, savaient qu'il y avait une relation qui écrasait celle qu'on avait avec eux. C'était très souvent pas très agréable pour elles. C'est vraiment les tiers qui ont fait les frais un peu de cette relation que nous avons établie entre nous. Donc elle n'est pas non plus incritiquable, cette relation, puisqu'elle implique que quelquefois on ne se conduise pas très correctement avec des gens.
Quelquefois, ça a été sur le dos des autres.
Voilà, oui. Exactement.
C'est ça. Et cette décision de ne pas, s'il y a eu une, je ne sais pas, est-ce qu'il y a eu une décision de ne pas avoir un enfant ou c'est venu tout naturellement? Pour vous,
moi,
vous deux?
C'est venu tout naturellement. Non pas que je répugnais a priori l'idée d'avoir des enfants, puisque quand j'étais très très jeune et que je pensais à faire un mariage bourgeois avec mon cousin Jacques, ça impliquait des enfants. Mais ma relation avec Sartre était telle que, tout de même sur une base plus intellectuelle que précisément institutionnelle, familiale ou quoi que ce soit, que je n'ai jamais éprouvé le désir d'avoir un enfant. Et ça, je l'ai expliqué d'ailleurs. Je n'avais pas tellement envie d'avoir une reproduction de Sartre, moi il me suffisait, et je n'avais pas envie non plus d'avoir une reproduction de moi-même, je me suffisais.
In the 1970s, de Beauvoir became involved with the French feminist movement. She signed a petition, along with other well-known French women, stating that she had had an illegal abortion and went on pro-abortion marches, becoming a figurehead not only for the women's movement in France, but around the world.
Getting to see Simone de Beauvoir was getting to see a famous person, you know. So I'd resort to the horrid little dodges people do. I would send her flowers and let her know where I was staying. And then if she wanted to see me, she could, and I wouldn't be a nuisance. And she'd call up, and all the people in the hotel would just go insane because it was Simone de Beauvoir. And it was really strange that there could be a country where a writer or an intellectual was like, wow, a movie star or royalty or something like that. The respect that was accorded her in France. Seeing her once a year made you understand what it was you were doing. And so the hate mongers didn't matter, and the reactionaries didn't matter, and the newspapers didn't matter, and what mattered was the purpose. And she reminded you of the purpose. I owe a great debt to the second sex. I couldn't have written Sexual Politics without it. Without the philosophic and historical perspective that she gives to the condition of women, or she defined all that brilliantly. What I wanted to do, though, was different. De Beauvoir deals really a great deal with the inner perception of the feminine condition. And, you know, there's, women are les autres, the others. The human condition is male. That is, men being in power have decided that the human condition is what they are, and we're something else. I wanted to have a kind of what they call structural analysis of how an institution works, namely patriarchy. So I'm really much more interested in the politics than in the psychology. And it's a difference in perspective and approach. There are two ways in which de Beauvoir's autobiography has helped me as a writer of autobiography. One is her memoirs, which we all know, The Dutiful Daughter, and the middle years, and this whole chronicle of her life, which for a lot of women in my generation, not just myself, and this was the only public life of another woman we even knew that was directly autobiographical, as opposed to, say, Doris Lessing's fictionalized autobiography. Also very useful to us. But we needed very much a picture of how, well, how anyone was doing it. How were they living? How were they becoming these realized independent women and so forth? What were their lives in fact like? Not just our tiny little miniature lives in graduate school and so forth, but here is an example of people who would let us into their charm circle and give us a notion of the obstacles they dealt with and how hard it was for them. They were all innovating. The book on old age is probably ultimately going to be as important as The Second Sex. It's just as revolutionary, it's just as obnoxious a message, perhaps. That is, it disturbs the status quo tremendously. It makes us deal with the inhumanity, not only of our treatment of the aged, but of the fact that age is part of the whole, you know, you're young and middle-aged, and then you're old, and that's part of your life. You're not less young, you're old. And so if we could come to terms with that, we would live much, much better lives, I think. It's a very subversive book, and I think it's going to make a lot of difference over time.
When I say that I am working on a study of old age, people generally exclaim, "What an extraordinary notion, but you aren't old. What a dismal subject." The myths and the clichés put out by bourgeois thought aim at holding up the elderly man as someone who is different, as another being. If old people show the same desires, the same feelings, and the same requirements as the young, the world looks upon them with disgust. In them, love and jealousy seem revolting or absurd, sexuality repulsive, and violence ludicrous. They are required to be a standing example of all the virtues. Above all, they are called upon to display serenity. The world asserts that they possess it, and this assertion allows the world to ignore their unhappiness. Let us recognize ourselves in this old man or that old woman. It must be done if we are to take upon ourselves the entirety of our human state. And when it is done, we will no longer acquiesce in the misery of the last age. We will no longer be indifferent, because we shall feel concerned, as indeed we are.
Towards the end of Sartre's life, his eyesight failed and he became increasingly ill. De Beauvoir took on the main burden of his care, reading to him and helping him to write. She recorded this stressful period in both their lives in a meticulously detailed account published after his death. Adieu, a farewell to Sartre.
This is the first of my books, the only one, no doubt, that you will not have read before it is printed. It is wholly and entirely devoted to you, and you are not affected by it. When we were young, and one of us gained a brilliant victory over the other in an impassioned argument, the winner used to say, "There you are in your little box." You are in your little box. You will not come out of it, and I shall not join you there. Even if I am buried next to you, there will be no communication between your ashes and mine. When I say you, it is only a pretense, a rhetorical device. No one hears it. I am speaking to no one. I have spoken about myself a little, because the witness is part of his evidence, but I have done so as seldom as possible. In the first place, because that is not what this book is about, and then because, as I replied to a friend who asked me how I was taking it, these things cannot be told. They cannot be put into writing. They cannot be formed in one's mind. They are experienced, and that is all.
These 10 last years of Sartre killed her because she had terrible health all her life. In the end, she was drinking a little too much, taking too much pills, and because it was terrible tension. You know. She was not ill, not at all. She was a little sick. She went to the hospital for examination.
L'écrivain Simone de Beauvoir, l'un des symboles de la libération des femmes, meurt à 78 ans.
Madame, Monsieur, bonsoir. 6 ans, à un jour près, après son compagnon Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir est morte aujourd'hui à l'âge de 78 ans à l'hôpital Cochin à Paris.
I think that in de Beauvoir's life, very much it's an exemplary life. Very much it's a life of action and living out for women everywhere and peers and an example to other women and women artists and so forth. It's a life that taught us a great deal, and that's a very big gift. It's a little more than the books even though the books are about that.
There would be no more work, no more volumes of the autobiography. A conversation that had at any rate gone on in my head from the time I was 20 years old was silenced. There was no more treasures that would come to me. There would be no more installments.
Both her writing and her life were important to us in terms of presenting a model, not necessarily one which we followed directly. I think the ideal of the independent woman was in fact an ideal which she never achieved, which it is perhaps impossible to achieve and perhaps not a very good thing to achieve. But she was struggling for that, and I think a lot of her own autobiography is an attempt to present a rational view of her life, to make it into a project without contradictions, in which she does achieve this aim of being independent. And perhaps it is as much the contradictions that we identify with, because we feel them and we live through them and we can't find a solution either.
Well, the funeral it was terribly sad, and it was also in a way kind of triumphant because so many women came, and it was, well, you know, funerals in France, they're sort of not state funerals, they're public demonstrations of philosophical principles. De Beauvoir's funeral was like that for French feminism and for French women in general, as well as for the existential school and things like that. She'd become history and part of French culture and civilization all at the same time. It was a coming of age, I think, for us, that this great pioneer and the one who'd led the way wasn't there anymore. And yet at the same time was now inside all of us to an extent. Now we'd have to remember it and become it.
The opportunities granted to me at the beginning helped me not only to lead a happy life, but to be happy in the life I led. I have been aware of my shortcomings and my limits, but I have made the best of them. When I was tormented by what was happening in the world, it was the world I wanted to change, not the place I had in it.